Welcome back, everybody. Good to see you. Good to have you with us one more time here. This is our last one before a few things happen. Halloween, which everybody kind of expects we talk about in terms of some kind of way about what that represents. Also, this is the last time we'll be talking before Election Day happens, and I know we've talked around that topic a fair amount here over the last number of months. I wanted to share a passage with you from Ecclesiastes. This is chapter 3. Everything that happens in this world happens at the time God chooses. He sets the time for birth and the time for death, the time for planting and the time for pulling up, the time for killing and the time for healing, the time for tearing down and the time for building. He sets the time for sorrow and the time for joy, the time for mourning and the time for dancing, the time for making love and the time for not making love, the time for kissing and the time for not kissing. He sets the time for finding and the time for losing, the time for saving and the time for throwing away, the time for tearing and the time for mending, the time for silence and the time for talk. He sets the time for love and the time for hate and the time for war and the time for peace. It's interesting, I've heard a lot of people talk about this passage over and over again. There's the 60s tune, maybe 70s tune, for everything there is a season. Turn, turn, turn. I've also heard 100 sermons go into detail on trying to figure out how you make all these little pieces work. And it's interesting when you look at this because if you're following along here, he gives him credit for a time for killing and a time for not, a time for hate and a time for love. And what we know from the revelations of Christ is that in Christ's world there is no time for hate, there is no time for killing, there's all the time in the world for love. And so I've heard many sermons try to parse and piece and go after all these individual pieces. And I have to admit that it does bother me a little bit going through things that way, because as so often with these stories, it's someone's perception of how this works. Someone's perception that God sets these times for all these things, and in truth, the beauty of the passage is that every time is God's time. And so whether it's a time of loss where we've lost someone, it's a time to find God. Whether it's a time where someone's hating us, we can take peace in our relationship with God and knowing that that hate is not going to affect us, and we can return that hate with love and hopefully win people to God's way of seeing things. I think it's a very appropriate time to do this now. We're actually standing here in our boat, which will be going away this weekend because the time for boating in Ohio is done and a time for something else comes. But when we're looking at these stories and we're thinking about how people took this, the reality of the story is that no matter what happens, God is there for us to help us pick up the pieces and put things back together. God is there to bring us peace, to help us have the strength to give love where people show us hatred. And when I just say those words, I have to say that I think about the chaos in the world that we live in today, because we're all looking for responses to hatred or pushback on this or the rest or whatever it is. And in this vein, I have to come back and just fall in love with our author in Ecclesiastes, who simply says whatever it is that's happening, God has the answers. He has the time. So tomorrow is Halloween, and I know some folks will celebrate that in some kind of way, and others will tell people that they shouldn't be. I hope everybody is safe in this COVID environment that we live in. And then Tuesday we have Election Day, and I've heard a lot of thunder from people saying this is the moral choice and that's the moral choice, and all this war and tension and buildup is going on. But what I ask you to do and challenge you to do is remember that we're living in God's time. And the answer is not to push back with anger or hatred or sticking your nose up in victory or whatever that would be, no matter what happens in terms of your side, is to recognize that with God, the answer to hatred is love. The answer to death is life. The answer to wounding or hurting is healing and caring for. And as God's people, we need to be in that healing, caring for, loving stance. It's time for God's people, like no other, to stand up. And so it's autumn here, and appropriately autumn is a time for reaping. And I'm going to challenge you to go out this coming week and recognize your place in the world. It's not to celebrate a victory or a loss, or to dance on someone's defeat. It's not to tell somebody they're wrong or to point them this way. It's to bring Christ's passion back to the world. Thank you guys, and we hope you stay safe and have a good weekend. Take care. Bye-bye.